Nobody was supposed to hear it. The signal was buried deep inside an old frequency that nobody used anymore. It was weak. It was broken. It lasted only 13 seconds. But those 13 seconds were enough to change everything. Because the signal was human. And it was coming from a planet where no human was supposed to be alive. Sarah Chun was 67 years old. She lived alone in a small house in Kansas, far from the big cities, far from the Veltri checkpoints, far from the noise of a world that had already given up. Her neighbors thought she was just a quiet old woman who liked tea and old books. They did not know about the radio equipment in her basement. They did not know she had been a signal analyst for the human military before the war ended, before humanity lost, before everything changed. Every night Sarah went down her basement and she listened. She told herself it was just a hobby, something to do with her hands, something to fill the silence. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She was still looking for something. She did not know what. She just kept listening. On the night of March 4th, 2187, the basement was cold, and the tea on her desk had gone cold too, and Sarah was half asleep in her chair when the signal came through. At first, she thought it was interference, a ghost signal, old satellites still tumbling through space, sometimes throughout strange noise. She almost turned the dial and moved on. Almost. But something stopped her. There was a pattern inside the noise. Her old brain recognized it before her eyes even fully opened. She sat up straight. She turned the volume up. She pressed the headphones tighter against her ears, and she listened with every part of herself that had ever been a soldier. 13 seconds. Then silence. She ran it back, played it again. Her hands were shaking now, but not from the cold. She recognized the format. Compressed. Encrypted. Old human military code. The kind they used before the war ended. The kind nobody was supposed to use anymore because there was no human military left. The Veltri had made sure of that. She checked the source frequency. Her screen showed her the coordinates, and she stared at them for a long time without moving. The signal had come from Kepler 7b, the planet where humanity's last fleet had made their final stand. The planet where 30,000 human soldiers had died in a single day. The planet that was now nothing but dust and memory, according to every history book and every Veltri broadcast and every speech ever given about why humans should be grateful that the Veltri arrived to save what was left. No human ship had been near Kepler 7b in 10 years. Sarah wrote the signal data down on paper. Not on her computer. Paper. Because computers could be checked. Paper could be burned. She wrote everything down with a steady hand that surprised even herself, and then she began to work on the encryption. She still remembered the old codes. Some things never left a person, no matter how many years passed. It took her 40 minutes. 40 minutes of complete silence in that cold basement with her cold tea in her shaking hands and her heart beating too fast for a woman her age. And when the message finally decoded itself in her handwriting on that piece of paper, she read it 3 times before she believed it. The message said 8 words. Fleet Omega is alive. Do not trust them. Sarah sat very still. She read those 8 words again. She thought about what they meant. She thought about 10 years of Veltri patrols and Veltri news and Veltri schools teaching human children that the war was over and that humanity was lucky to be alive. She thought about the memorial walls covered in names of the dead. She thought about the statues and the speeches and the quiet, broken way that people had learned to live under protection that looked a lot like a cage. Fleet Omega was the last human fleet, the one that was destroyed at Kepler 7b, the one whose commander was listed on that memorial wall with a photograph and a date of death and a quote about sacrifice. Alive. Sarah folded the paper very carefully and put it inside an old book on her shelf. Then she turned off the equipment and sat in the dark for a moment trying to breathe normally, trying to think, trying to decide what a 67-year-old retired woman in Kansas was supposed to do with information that could shake the entire human world. Then she looked at the small window above her workbench. Outside, a Veltri patrol ship was moving slowly through the night sky above her street. Its lights were sweeping downward, house by house, getting closer, and it was turning toward her. For minutes. That was how long Sarah had before the patrol ship reached her house. She knew because she had watched them do this before from her window. Slow sweep, house by house. Each stop took about 40 seconds. There were 5 houses between her and them. For minutes. Maybe less if they moved faster tonight. She did not panic. Panic was for people who had never been in a real situation before. Sarah Chun had spent 12 years decoding enemy signals during the worst war humanity had ever fought. She had worked in rooms where the wrong move meant death for thousands of people. She had learned a long time ago that panic was just noise inside your head, and noise got people killed. She moved fast, but she moved clean. First, she wiped the equipment. Not destroyed. Wiping was smarter. Destruction looked like guilt. A clean machine looked like an old woman's hobby. She ran the wipe program that she had never actually expected to use, and while it ran, she picked up the headphones and the extra cables and put them in the cabinet under the stairs behind the winter coats where they had always been. Then she looked at the book on the shelf, the one with the folded paper inside it, the decoded message. Fleet Omega is alive. Do not trust them. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds thinking about whether to burn it. But burning left ash, and ash had a smell, and Veltri sensors were very good with smells. So she left the book where it was. One piece of paper inside one old book on a shelf full of old books. She would have to trust that. She went upstairs, put the kettle on, sat at her kitchen table with her hands around an empty mug, and waited. The knock came 2 minutes later. 2 of them. Tall, gray-skinned. Their eyes had that flat quality that always made Sarah feel like she was being looked at by something that had learned to pretend to care. They wore the standard patrol uniforms with a blue stripe that meant housing compliance unit. The polite version of the people who could take you away and not bring you back. Radiation sweep, the first one said. Routine check. May we come inside? It was not a question. It never was. Sarah stepped aside and let them in. She offered them tea because that was what a harmless old woman would do. They declined because they always declined. They moved through her house with their small gray scanners making soft clicking sounds, and Sarah walked behind them talking about her garden and the weather and the way her knees had been hurting since winter started. She talked the way old women talked when they were nervous, filling silence with nothing, giving them no space to think. They reached the basement door. Sarah kept talking. She said she had not been down there in weeks because of her knees. She said the stairs were steep and difficult. She said she mostly used it for storage now, since she stopped her little radio hobby because the equipment had stopped working properly anyway, and she had been meaning to clear it all out, but had not gotten around to it. The first officer opened the door, went down. The scanner clicked. Sarah counted her own heartbeats and kept her face completely still. He came back up after 90 seconds. Said something to the second officer in Veltri language that Sarah partially understood but pretended not to. The second officer nodded. They thanked her for her cooperation. They moved toward the front door, and then the second officer stopped. He turned around slowly. His flat eyes moved across the room, across Sarah, across the shelf of books near the window. He stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Sarah looked directly back at him. She did not look at the books. That was the most important thing. She looked at him the way a tired old woman would look at someone who was keeping her from going to bed. He turned and left. Sarah closed the front door. She did not move for a full minute. She just stood with her hand on the door and breathed. In and out, in and out. The patrol ship hummed overhead and then slowly moved on down the street. She went back to the kitchen, made actual tea this time, sat down. And then she looked at her own hand resting on the kitchen table, and she noticed something that made everything inside her go completely still. When the second officer had stopped and turned around, she had seen his hand near his side. The sleeve of his uniform had shifted slightly when he moved. Just a centimeter. Just enough. The skin underneath was not gray. It was human. Pink and warm and unmistakably human underneath a layer of something thin and artificial that had moved with him when he turned. Not a Veltri. A person. A human being wearing Veltri skin like a coat. Standing inside a patrol unit. Looking directly at her shelf of books. Looking directly at the exact book where she had hidden the message. Sarah set her mug down very carefully. Her mind was moving fast now. Not with panic. With something colder and sharper than panic. If there was a human inside the Velthry Patrol unit, then one of two things was true. Either that person was a traitor working for them, reporting back everything they found inside human homes, helping them hunt down people exactly like Sarah, or that person was something else entirely, and they had just looked directly at her book and walked away without saying a word. Sarah got up slowly. She walked to the shelf. She opened the book and looked at the folded paper inside. The message was still there, exactly as she had left it, untouched, but underneath it was something new. A second piece of paper, small, folded once, placed underneath hers so carefully that she almost missed it. She did not remember putting it there because she had not put it there. Someone had placed it in that book in the 90 seconds when the first officer was in the basement and the second officer was standing in her living room talking about nothing. Her hands were steady when she unfolded it. She was past shaking now. She was in that quiet place she used to find during the war when everything became very simple and very clear. For words, handwritten, small and careful. Find Marcus. He knows. She did not sleep that night. Sarah sat at her kitchen table until the sun came up, and she read those 4 words over and over until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like a door. Find Marcus. He knows. That was all. No last name. No location. No explanation. Just a name written by a hand that had been inside a Velthry Patrol unit and had chosen to leave her a message instead of turning her in. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it very carefully the way she used to think about signals during the war. Every signal had a sender. Every sender had a reason. The question was never just what the message said. The question was always why someone chose to send it at all. Someone inside the Velthry system was helping her. That meant someone inside the Velthry system already knew about her, already knew what she had found, already knew enough to trust her with a name. That should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Useful. She started the next morning the way anyone would start if they were a harmless old woman with nothing to hide. She walked to the market. She bought vegetables. She nodded at her neighbors. She let the Velthry checkpoint scanner read her identification card, and she smiled at the officer the way she always smiled, and she moved on. She was invisible. Old women were always invisible, and Sarah had spent 10 years being very good at it. She spent 3 days listening, watching, asking small questions in the way that old women could ask questions without anyone noticing. She mentioned to the woman at the market that her grandson was looking for work, and did she know anyone hiring. She mentioned to the man who fixed her fence that she had heard there was a community meeting at the library on Tuesday. Small things, normal things, the kind of things that opened doors without looking like you were trying to open them. On the second day, she heard the name Marcus. A young man, 20-something, worked for the Velthry translation office downtown. Quiet, serious, never talked about politics, never caused trouble. Exactly the kind of person nobody looked at twice. On Tuesday morning, Sarah went to the library. She walked through Section 1 and Section 2 and Section 3 the way a woman looking for a book would walk. Slow, browsing, touching spines with her fingers. She reached Section 7 near the back of the building where the old history books lived that nobody read anymore, because the Velthry had rewritten the curriculum and history had become a subject that made people ask uncomfortable questions. She found the book with the red spine on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. She pulled it out. It was heavy and old, and the title was something about Earth geology that nobody would ever want to read. She opened it, and inside the front cover someone had written a number in pencil. So faint she almost missed it. A time, 11:15. Sarah put the book back. She sat in a reading chair nearby and read a different book about nothing for 40 minutes. At 11:15, exactly a section of the back wall opened. Not dramatically, not like something from an old movie. Just a quiet click and a thin gap where the bookshelf met the wall, and a young man's face appearing in the gap, looking at her with eyes that were trying very hard to look calm and not quite managing it. He was young, maybe 25, dark hair cut short. He was wearing a Velthry translation office badge on his jacket, and his hands were gripping the edge of the shelf door like he needed something to hold on to. He looked at Sarah the way people looked at things they had been told about, but never actually expected to see in real life. Sarah walked over without hurrying. She stepped through the gap. He closed it behind her. The room behind the bookshelf was small and cold and had the feeling of a place that had been used carefully for a long time. There was a single light, a small table, 2 chairs, a map on the wall that someone had tried to cover with a sheet but had not quite succeeded. Sarah could see the edge of it. Stars. Human military notation. Old but detailed. The young man stood with his back against the wall and looked at her. "My name is Marcus," he said. His voice was quiet, and he spoke the way people spoke when they had learned to never speak too loudly. "I've been waiting for someone to hear that signal for 3 years." Sarah sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him the way she used to look at young soldiers who had important information and too much fear mixed together. "Tell me everything," she said. So he did. He told her that Commander Reeves was alive. He told her that the fleet was real. He told her that the war had never actually ended. It had just moved somewhere humanity was not supposed to look. He told her that the Velthri knew the fleet existed but could not find it because Commander Reeves had taken the ships into a region of dark matter so dense that Velthri scanning technology could not penetrate it. He told her that for 10 years, 3,000 human ships had been hiding in the dark, waiting for a moment that kept not arriving. And he told her the worst part, the part that made the whole 10 years make a sick and perfect sense. The Velthri were not afraid of the fleet attacking them. They were using Earth as a reason for the fleet not to attack. As long as humans on Earth believed the war was lost, they would never send a signal to the fleet. And as long as the fleet received no signal from Earth, they had no way of knowing what was happening down here. No way of knowing that the people they were protecting were living quietly inside a lie. The Velthri had not conquered humanity with weapons. They had conquered humanity with a story. And it was working. Sarah listened to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered. "How do we reach the fleet?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer. His phone buzzed on the table between them. He looked down at it. The color left his face so fast that Sarah actually reached forward to make sure he did not fall. He looked up at her. His voice had gone very small. "They arrested Commander Reeves," he whispered. "1 hour ago. They are announcing the execution in 72 hours. The single light in the small, cold room hummed quietly above them. The map on the wall with its careful stars and its human military notation seemed very far away suddenly. 3,000 ships hiding in the dark. A commander in a Velthri prison. An old woman and a frightened young man sitting in a secret room behind a library bookshelf. Sarah looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at Marcus. "Then we have 72 hours, she said. "Start talking." 72 hours was nothing. Sarah had worked with shorter windows during the war. She had decoded enemy transmissions in 20 minutes that other analysts said would take days. She had once kept an entire forward base alive by finding a single wrong frequency in a Velthri jamming signal while bombs were falling 3 kilometers away. 72 hours was not nothing. 72 hours was actually quite a lot if you used every second of it correctly. But first she needed to understand what they were actually dealing with. Marcus pulled up the public Velthri broadcast on his phone, and they sat together in that small cold room and watched it. The announcement was clean and professional the way Velthri announcements always were. A gray-skinned officer standing at a podium with the kind of expression that was designed to look like justice. Behind him on a large screen was a photograph. A man, older than Sarah remembered from the news files. Thinner, gray at the temples, but standing straight in the photograph, even with Velthri restraints on his wrists. Standing like someone who had decided a long time ago that they would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them bend. Commander James Reeves, captured alive, charged with military aggression against protected civilian zones. Execution scheduled in 72 hours by order of the Velthri Governance Council. Marcus turned the broadcast off. He could not look at it anymore. Sarah looked at it until the screen went dark on its own. She was memorizing the background details. The type of restraints, the uniform they had put Reeves in, the small identification tag on his chest that told anyone who knew old military code exactly which prison ship he was being held on. Reeves had known the camera was on him. He had made sure that tag was visible. Even if photograph taken at the moment of his capture he had been sending information. That was the kind of man they were dealing with. "There's someone else," Marcus said quietly. He was staring at the covered map on the wall. "Someone who has been helping from inside. Her name is Zara. She is a Velthari communications officer, but she has been passing information to the Resistance for 2 years. Small things. Safe house locations. Patrol schedules. She's the one who told me about you. About your signal work. About what you might hear if you were listening on the right frequency." Sarah thought about the patrol officer with the human hands. She thought about the note left inside her book in 90 seconds of perfect silence. "Is Zara human?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "She is Velthari, but she has her own reasons for what she does. I have never asked her what they are. I do not think that is the kind of question you ask someone who is risking everything to help you." Sarah accepted that. Some things did not need explaining. You judge people by what they did, not by why they did it. They contacted Zara through a method so old and simple that no Velthari monitoring system would think to look for it. A specific pattern of lights in a specific window at a specific time. 3 hours later, Zara's response came back through the same method. A meeting. That night. The old water treatment facility on the east side of the city that the Velthari had shut down 4 years ago and never bothered to properly secure because it was large and empty and smelled terrible. Zara was already there when they arrived. She was tall even by Velthari standards, and her eyes were not flat the way most of them were. They moved. They noticed things. She looked at Sarah for a long moment when they were introduced, and then she nodded once as if Sarah had passed some kind of test she had not known she was taking. "The execution is a trap," Zara said without any introduction. Her voice was low and precise. She spoke human language without any accent, which meant she had been practicing for a long time. "They are expecting the fleet to attempt a rescue. Commander Reeves is the only person who knows the exact coordinates of the Dark Zone entry point. Without him, the fleet cannot navigate out safely. The Velthari believe the fleet generals will risk everything to get him back. When they come out of the Dark Zone to attempt the rescue, the Velthari tracking array will lock onto their signature and follow them back in. 3,000 ships found and destroyed in one operation." Marcus leaned against the wall. His face had gone through several expressions and had settled on something tired and frightened and angry all at the same time. "So we cannot rescue him," he said, "and we cannot let him be executed. And we have 72 hours. Zara said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. Sarah had been quiet through all of it. She was thinking about something specific, something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the library. She had listened to the original 13-second transmission dozens of times in her memory, the way she used to replay signals during the war. And there was something inside it that she had not fully understood yet. A quality to the compression, a pattern underneath the pattern. "Can you get me access to the original transmission?" she asked Zara. "The full raw file, not the decoded version, the actual signal." Zara looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because Commander Reeves did not just send a message," Sarah said. "He is not the kind of man who sends a message when he could send a weapon. There's something else inside that signal. I do not know what it is yet, but it is there." Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her uniform and placed a small data chip on the table between them. "He sent this 4 hours ago," she said, "from inside the prison ship. We do not know how. The signal was addressed to a specific frequency. Your frequency. He knew you were listening." Sarah picked up the chip. She looked at it sitting in her palm. A tiny thing, smaller than her thumbnail, sent by a man in chains from inside an enemy prison ship, specifically to an old woman in Kansas who he had never met. She closed her fingers around it. Back in the library room, she plugged the chip into her oldest and most basic reader. No network connection. No Velthari signal touch possible. Just the chip and the reader in Sarah's eyes. The message was short. No greeting. No explanation. Just words the way a military man wrote words when he had very little time and a great deal to say. "Do not save me. Save the frequency. Everything is in the frequency. They captured me, but they do not know what they captured. The signal is not just a message. Look underneath it. You will understand when you see it. You already know how. You have always known how. Do not waste time on me. Use the time on the signal. When you find what is inside it, you will know exactly what to do." It was not signed. It did not need to be. Sarah read it twice. Then she opened the raw signal file from Zara's chip, and she began to look underneath it. Really look. The way she had not let herself look the first time because she had been frightened and cold and alone in a basement with a patrol ship outside her window. She looked for 3 minutes, and then she stopped. Her hand came up slowly and covered her mouth. Because underneath the message, underneath the encryption, buried inside the compression like seeds inside a fruit, there were numbers, thousands and thousands of numbers. Not random, not noise, perfectly ordered, perfectly precise, the kind of precision that only came from one thing. Coordinates, not dozens, not hundreds. Every single weak point in the entire Velthary defense network. All of it, in one signal, sent by one man from inside a prison ship 4 hours ago. Commander Reeves had not been captured. He had walked in. She stared at the numbers for a long time. Thousands of coordinates, each one clean and precise, and tagged with a Velthary military identifier that Sarah recognized from her years of signal work during the war. Weapon arrays, command ship positions, shield generator locations, supply line routes, communication towers, everything. Every single piece of the Velthary military infrastructure mapped out in perfect detail and buried inside a 13-second transmission that the Velthary themselves had been scanning for and had completely missed. Because they had been looking for a message. They had not been looking for a map. Sarah sat back in her chair and thought about Commander Reeves walking into capture deliberately. Walking into a Velthary prison ship with this inside his transmission. Letting them take him because the taking of him was never the point. The transmission was the point. Getting this information to someone who could read, it was the point. He had built his own capture into the plan the way a good commander built every possible outcome into a plan. Even the bad ones. Even the ones that cost him personally. She thought about that for exactly 1 minute. She allowed herself that 1 minute of something that felt close to admiration. Then she closed it away and got back to work because admiration did not win wars, and she had less than 48 hours. She called Marcus back to the library room. She showed him the coordinates on the screen without saying anything. She watched his face go through the same journey hers had gone through. Confusion first, then understanding, then something that was not quite hope, because hope was a fragile word but was in that direction. "We need to reach the fleet," he said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Do you know how to build a transmitter strong enough to reach the dark zone?" he asked. She had already been thinking about this. The dark zone where Fleet Omega was hiding was not impossibly far. The problem was not distance. The problem was penetration. Dark matter was dense in ways that normal signals could not push through. You needed a specific type of transmission, a frequency that moved differently than standard signals. During the war, the human military had used what they called a fold frequency, a signal that did not push through the dark matter, but instead moved along the edges of it the way water moved along the edge of a rock. She had built a fold frequency transmitter once before, in a basement in Seoul during the 3rd year of the war, with equipment she had taken from a destroyed communication post and tools she had borrowed from a repair shop without asking. She had been 37 years old and working on 4 hours of sleep, and she had done it in 6 hours. She was 67 now. She had more experience and steadier hands, and she knew exactly what she had done wrong the first time. "I can build it," she told Marcus. "I need parts." Zara came through again. It took her 14 hours to gather everything Sarah needed without triggering any Velthary supply monitoring systems. Old satellite components. A signal amplifier from a decommissioned human communication tower that the Velthary had shut down but not fully stripped. 3 specific resistors that Sarah had to describe so precisely that Marcus had to write the description down to give to Zara because they were not the kind of thing anyone sold anymore. While Zara gathered parts, Sarah drew the transmitter design on paper. Not from memory alone, from understanding. There was a difference. Memory could fail under pressure. Understanding held even when you were tired and frightened and working in a cold room with a deadline that kept getting smaller. Marcus watched her draw and said nothing. He had learned quickly that Sarah worked better in silence, and he was a fast learner. On the second day, with 18 hours remaining, Zara arrived with the last components and something else. Information. Her voice was very controlled when she delivered it, which Sarah had learned meant the information was bad. "The fleet has a problem," Zara said. "I intercepted a compressed transmission from the Dark Zone 2 hours ago. They are running on emergency reserves. 6 days of fuel remaining. After that, their ships begin to drift. They lose navigation. They lose weapon systems. They lose everything. 6 days, and Fleet Omega stops being a fleet and starts being 3,000 pieces of metal floating in the dark." Marcus closed his eyes. Sarah kept drawing. 6 days was enough, she said without looking up. "We'll be sending them coordinates before 6 days. The transmitter will be ready in 4 hours. The signal will reach them in 12 minutes after that." She paused and looked up at Zara. "What is the condition of the Velthary shield array around Earth right now?" Honestly, Zara hesitated in the way she hesitated when the answer was something she had not been authorized to share. Then she seemed to make a decision. 40%, she said quietly. "The shields are at 40% capacity. They have been for 2 years. The generators are failing, and the replacement components are stuck in a supply dispute between 2 Velthary Council factions. They have been telling Earth broadcasts that the shields are at full strength. They are not." Sarah looked at her steadily. "So when the fleet arrives, the Velthary cannot actually protect themselves the way they have been claiming they can." "No," Zara said. "They cannot." Sarah nodded once and went back to her drawing. The shape of the transmitter was coming together on the paper now. Clean lines. Simple construction. Something that an old woman with steady hands could build in a cold library room with borrowed parts and could carry in a bag if she needed to move quickly. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at the design. Then he looked at Sarah. He wanted to ask something, and she could see him deciding whether to ask it. "Ask," she said. He asked, "If we send this signal, the Velthary will triangulate our position in minutes. Their detection systems will lock onto a fold frequency transmission almost immediately. They will know exactly where we are. They will send people to that location very fast." "Yes," Sarah said. "So we send the signal, and then we have maybe 4 minutes before they arrive here." "Approximately," she said. "Maybe 3. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map on the wall that was no longer covered with a sheet because there was no point covering it anymore. 3,000 little marks on that map, each one representing a human ship that had been hiding in the dark for 10 years, waiting for someone to find them. He looked back at Sarah. "You already know we were going to send it anyway," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. The frightened quality in his eyes did not disappear entirely, but something settled behind it. Something that looked like a decision being made and accepted. They built the transmitter together over the next 4 hours. Sarah worked, and Marcus handed her components and held connections in place while she soldered them and read measurements back to her when she needed numbers checked. He was not an engineer, but he was precise, and he followed instructions without adding unnecessary commentary, and those 2 qualities were worth more than technical knowledge in a situation like this. At the end of 4 hours, the transmitter sat on the small table in the library room. It was not beautiful. It was a collection of old parts and careful connections in one very specific fold frequency array that Sarah had built from a satellite dish component and 2 resistors and something she did not have a technical name for, but knew worked from the time she had built one before in Seoul. Zara stood by the door. She had been there for the last 2 hours. Watching. Ready. Sarah loaded the coordinates into the transmission. All of them. Every weapon array location. Every command ship position. Every shield generator weakness. Everything Commander Reeves had buried inside 13 seconds and sent from a prison ship to an old woman in Kansas. She looked at Marcus. He looked at her. "You know what happens to us after we send this," she said. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We become the reason humanity wins." Sarah looked at the transmitter. She thought about 37 years old in a basement in Seoul. She thought about Commander Reeves standing straight in a photograph with restraints on his wrists. She thought about 3,000 ships running out of time in the dark and 6 days of fuel and a 40% shield array that the Velthary had been lying about for 2 years. She pressed send. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then every Velthary alarm on Earth went off at exactly the same time. The alarms were everywhere. Every Velthary patrol ship in the city lit up at the same moment. Every checkpoint tower switched to red. Every broadcast screen on every street corner cut from its regular programming to an emergency frequency that showed nothing but a spinning Veltri alert symbol and a voice repeating the same words over and over in a tone that was trying very hard to sound controlled and was not quite managing it. Unidentified fleet signature detected. All units to defensive positions. Unidentified fleet signature detected. Marcus was already on his feet, moving toward the door. Sarah put her hand on his arm and stopped him. She was looking at her small secondary monitor, the one connected to the old military frequency scanner that she had rebuilt from parts while making the transmitter. The one that was showing her something that made her stand very still with her hand on Marcus's arm and her eyes on the screen, and something building in her chest that she had not felt in 10 years. "They are not coming from the direction the Veltri are looking," she said quietly. Marcus looked at the screen. The Veltri defensive ships were repositioning toward the outer solar system. Standard response. Threat detected at distance. Move to intercept before it reaches Earth. Clean military logic. But the signals on Sarah's scanner were not coming from the outer solar system. They were coming from directly above. The dark zone entry point was not where the Veltri tracking models had predicted it would be, because Commander Reeves had not taken the fleet into the nearest section of dark matter. He had taken them into a section that sat almost directly overhead relative to Earth's position. Closer, much closer. A location that the Veltri had dismissed as too unstable for fleet operations. Too risky. Too difficult to navigate. 3,000 human ships had been hiding 12 light minutes above Earth's head for 10 years, and the Veltri had never once thought to look straight up. The fleet dropped out of the dark matter cover all at once. Sarah's scanner could not display 3,000 ships individually. It was not built for that. But it showed the mass signature, and the mass signature was so large that the display simply filled with light. White and clean and enormous. Like someone had turned on a star directly above the planet. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. Outside the library window, Sarah could hear it starting. People on the street stopping, looking up. The patrol ships that had been moving with such confident speed toward the outer solar system were now stopping too. Turning, trying to understand what their instruments were telling them, because their instruments were telling them something that did not fit inside the Veltri model of how this situation was supposed to go. The Veltri Supreme Commander's voice came through on the emergency broadcast. Sarah recognized his voice from 10 years of Earth broadcasts. He was always very calm. He was always very certain. He was the voice that had told humanity the war was over. He was the voice that had explained why Veltri protection was necessary and permanent and good for everyone. He did not sound calm now. The words were in Veltri language, but Zara translated them quietly from her position by the door. Her voice was completely flat, professional, like she was translating a weather report. "He is ordering the shield array to maximum power," Zara said. "He is ordering the weapon platforms to target the incoming fleet. He is telling the Council it is a bluff, that the fleet does not have the capability for a full engagement, that they will stand down when the shields come up." Sarah looked at her. 40%, she said. Zara nodded. 40%, she confirmed. The Veltri shield array around Earth came online. Sarah could see the power signature on her scanner. It was large. It looked impressive on any standard monitoring system. To anyone who did not know what full power actually looked like, it would seem like an impenetrable wall. Fleet Omega knew exactly what full power looked like. They had been fighting the Veltri for 10 years. They had seen real shields. They had broken through real shields. What was in front of them now was not a real shield. It was a curtain painted to look like a wall. 200 human ships peeled away from the main fleet formation before the Veltri weapon platforms had finished their targeting sequence. They moved fast, not toward the Veltri ships, toward Earth. They positioned themselves in a pattern that Sarah recognized immediately from old military tactical manuals. A dispersed barrier formation, thin enough that Veltri weapons could theoretically punch through it, dense enough that doing so would cost the Veltri more ships than they could afford to lose right now. It was a message, delivered in the language that militaries understood better than any other. You cannot hit Earth without going through us first. And going through us will break you. The main fleet kept moving. The Velthri weapon platforms fired. Massive shots, powerful and precise, and exactly what 10 years of unchallenged authority looked like when it finally had something to shoot at. Sarah watched the scanner. She watched the shots hit the fleet formation. She watched 3 human ships take direct hits and go dark on her display. She did not look away. She had never looked away during the war either. The fleet did not slow down. It returned fire with everything it had. 10 years of waiting compressed into a single coordinated strike that hit the Velthri defensive line at 17 different points simultaneously. The coordinates that Commander Reeves had buried in his transmission. Every weak point, every gap, every place where Velthri armor was thinner than it looked. The fleet hit all of them at once because they had the map, and the map was perfect. The Velthri defensive line did not break, but it bent badly. On Earth, people were outside now. Sarah could hear them through the library walls. Voices. Hundreds of voices all at once. Not screaming. Not panicking. Something stranger than that. Something quieter and more complicated. Zara moved to the window and looked out. Her expression did not change, but she watched the people in the street for a long moment. "They're looking up," she said. All of them. Just standing and looking up. Marcus moved to stand beside her. Sarah stayed at her scanner. She could not afford to look away from the data right now. But she listened to what Zara said next. "An old man," she said, standing on the corner. "He is crying. He is pointing at the sky and saying something." Zara paused. She said the words quietly, like they were fragile. "He is saying, 'I knew it. I told them. We never give up.'" Sarah kept her eyes on the scanner. Her jaw was tight. On the street, a child's voice cut through all the other noise. High and clear, and asking the question with the complete honesty that only children managed. "Did we win?" the child asked. "Did we finally win?" Sarah heard the answer, but she did not hear it with words. She heard it in the way the voices outside changed. The way they shifted from confusion into something else. Something that had been buried under 10 years of a story that said humanity had lost. Something that did not have a single clean name, but felt like morning after a very long night. And then her scanner showed her something new. The Velthri command ship. The largest ship in their formation. The one sitting at the center of their defensive position like the heart of everything they had built. It had stopped firing at the fleet. It had turned its weapons toward Earth. Specifically toward one city. Sarah looked at the targeting data on her screen. She looked at the coordinates the Velthri command ship had locked onto. She looked at them for 2 full seconds before she understood what she was seeing. Her city, the street outside, the old man who had said we never give up, the child asking if they had won, the library, this room, this table, this scanner in her hands. The Velthri Supreme Commander had made a decision. He could not win the battle, so he had decided to make humanity understand what losing felt like. He was going to make an example. And Sarah Chan was standing right in the middle of it. For minutes. That was what the targeting data said. For minutes between the Velthri command ship locking its weapons onto her city and those weapons reaching full charge and firing. Sarah had seen Velthri weapon systems up close during the war. She knew what full charge meant. It did not mean damage. It did not mean casualties. It meant the city would simply stop existing. Everything inside the target radius converted to heat and light, and then nothing at all. For minutes. Marcus saw the targeting data 2 seconds after she did. He grabbed her arm. "We need to go," he said. "Right now. We need to get out of the building and away from the center, and Sarah, we need to move." Sarah did not move. She was looking at something on the secondary display. Something small. Something that had been sitting in the corner of her scanner readout for the past 30 seconds while she had been focused on the fleet engagement data. A number. Cycling. Repeating on a precise interval. 90 seconds. Then reset. Then 90 seconds again. She knew what that number was. During the war, the Velthri had built a security feature into their heavy weapon systems after a series of accidental discharges had destroyed 3 of their own supply depots. A confirmation ping. Every heavy weapon system above a certain destructive threshold required a live communication handshake from the command vessel every 90 seconds during the charging cycle. If the handshake was interrupted, the weapon system paused its charge and reset to 0. It was a safety measure, designed to prevent accidents, designed to make sure nobody fired a city-destroying weapon without continuous deliberate authorization from command. It was also a frequency, and frequencies could be jammed. Sarah sat down at her equipment. Her hands were already moving. Marcus stared at her. "What are you doing?" he said. His voice had gone very high and very tight. "Sarah, we have 4 minutes." "I know," she said. "Be quiet and let me work." Zara crossed the room in 3 steps and looked at Sarah's screen. She understood immediately. Her eyes moved to the cycling number and back to Sarah's hands on the equipment, and she made a fast calculation that Sarah could see happening in her expression. "The jam will not hold," Zara said. "They will identify the interference source and compensate within 30 to 40 seconds. You can disrupt the handshake once, maybe twice, then they will route around you. Each disruption resets the charge to 0, Sarah said. "If I can do it every 80 seconds, I buy the fleet a window." She looked up at Zara briefly. "How long does the fleet need to get a clear shot at the command ship weapon array?" Zara was already on her communication device. Her fingers moved fast. She sent something and waited. For seconds. A response came back. She looked at Sarah. 6 minutes, she said. "They need 6 minutes to break through the current Veltri defensive screen and get into firing range of the command ship." Sarah did the calculation instantly. For minutes on the clock, 90-second handshake intervals. She could disrupt it twice before they rerouted. That bought approximately 3 minutes. She needed 6, which meant she needed 4 disruptions, which meant she needed to find a way to keep jamming a signal after the Veltri identified her interference source and compensated for it. She looked at her equipment. She looked at the transmitters she had built from satellite parts and borrowed components. She thought about the fold frequency. She thought about something she had understood about Veltri communication architecture during the war, something she had written in a report that nobody had acted on because the war had ended before it became relevant. Veltri command communication used a layered routing system. When interference hit the primary channel, it automatically shifted to the secondary channel. When the secondary was hit, it shifted to the tertiary. There were 4 channels total. If you could hit all 4 in sequence fast enough, you could keep the reset cycling almost indefinitely. Almost. She could not do it alone. The timing required 2 sets of hands on 2 separate pieces of equipment executing disruptions on a precise alternating pattern. One person could not move fast enough between the channels to maintain the sequence without gaps. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. He had heard everything. He understood what she was asking before she asked it. She could see him understanding it. She could see him understanding specifically that what she was asking required them to stay in this room for 6 minutes, while a weapon system that could erase a city was charging 40 kilometers above their heads. He sat down at the secondary equipment. "Show me what to do," he said. Sarah showed him. She did it fast and clean with no unnecessary words. Channel sequence. Timing interval. What the display would show when a disruption landed correctly. What would show when it failed. He repeated everything back to her with complete accuracy. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "Good," she said. "Do not watch the window. Watch the display." He nodded. He did not watch the window. They started. The first disruption hit at 3 minutes 40 seconds on the countdown. The weapon charge reset to 0. Sarah watched the Veltri system immediately begin rerouting to the secondary channel. She hit the secondary channel before it fully established. Reset again. Marcus hit the tertiary on her signal. Reset. The Veltri technicians on the command ship were fast. Faster than she had expected. They identified the interference source in 22 seconds. She saw them compensating on her display, rerouting around her jamming frequency, finding gaps in her disruption pattern. She changed the pattern. This was the part that could not be taught quickly. The part that came from 12 years of signal work and 30 years of thinking about how communication systems failed under pressure. She did not jam the channels in the sequence the Veltri expected her to use. She jammed them in the sequence that exploited the half-second delay in their rerouting logic. The gap between when the system identified interference and when it successfully compensated. Half a second was nothing in normal life. In signal work, half a second was enormous. Marcus matched her timing without being told. He watched her hands and matched them. He was not an engineer, but he was precise and he was brave, and right now, those two things were exactly enough. 2 minutes passed. The weapon charge reset 6 times. On the 7th attempt, the Velthory broke through her jamming completely. Sarah saw it happening on the display. They had brought a second communication system online, a backup she had not accounted for because it was a newer system than anything she had encountered during the war. The charge began climbing again, faster this time. Emergency charging rate. They were angry now, and they were not being careful anymore. 50% charge. 60. 70. Sarah looked at her display. She looked at the fleet engagement data in the corner of the screen. She looked at the position of the human ships relative to the Velthory command ship. "Come on," she said quietly. It was not directed at anyone in the room. 80% charge. 85. Marcus was very still beside her. He was not watching the window. He was watching her face instead of the display now. She did not tell him to stop. She understood why he was doing it. 90%. Then the fleet engagement display showed her something. A gap in the Velthory defensive screen. Small, maybe 40 seconds wide. 12 human ships accelerating through it at maximum speed, moving toward the command ship weapon array at an angle that would give them a clean shot. They had seen the window she had bought them. They were coming through it. 95% charge. The sound that came through her scanner speaker was not an explosion. Velthory weapon arrays did not explode when they were hit. They collapsed. A specific harmonic collapse that produced a sound like every piece of glass in a very large building breaking at exactly the same moment. High and clean, and then completely silent. The charge reading on her display dropped to 0. Not because of a reset, because there was nothing left to charge. Sarah took her hands off the equipment. She sat very still for a moment. The scanner showed her the Velthory command ship moving erratically. Its weapon array was gone. Its defensive positioning was broken. The fleet was pouring through the gap in the screen now. All of it. The full weight of 3,000 ships that had been waiting in the dark for 10 years, falling on a defensive line that had already been bent badly and was now breaking completely. Marcus let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for approximately 6 minutes. He looked at Sarah. His voice was very quiet. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. Sarah looked at her hands on the table. They were not shaking. They had not shaken once during the entire 6 minutes. She found that mildly interesting. "I don't know," she said honestly. Outside the window, the city was still there. The old man was still on the corner. The child was still asking questions. The voices were still rising in that direction that felt like mourning. And then through her scanner speaker came a sound she had not heard in 10 years. A Velthory voice. The Supreme Commander. The one who had told humanity the war was over. The one who had been the voice of 10 years of careful and comfortable lies. He was not calm anymore. He was not certain anymore. He spoke 4 words in heavily accented human language. 4 words that came through the scanner speaker into the small, cold library room where an old woman and a frightened young man sat at equipment built from borrowed parts. "We request," Zara translated quietly. Her voice had something in it that Sarah had never heard from her before. Something that sounded almost like relief. "We request negotiation." Hay brought Commander Reeves in 40 minutes later. The exchange happened in open space between the two fleets. A single Velthory shuttle moving slowly toward a single human ship with every weapon on both sides pointed at everything and nobody firing, because nobody wanted to be the one who ended the negotiation before it started. Sarah watched the shuttle's movement on her scanner. She watched the docking sequence complete. She watched the human ship's signal change from standby to active in a way that meant someone important had just come aboard. She sat back in her chair and waited. Marcus had fallen asleep, sitting up at the secondary equipment. His head was tilted against the wall, and his mouth was slightly open, and he looked about 19 years old. Sarah looked at him for a moment and thought about what he had done tonight. A 25-year-old translation worker who had spent 3 years waiting in a secret room behind a library bookshelf for someone to hear the right signal. who had sat next to her for 6 minutes under a weapon charging to destroy his city, and had not moved, and had not looked away, and had matched her timing without being asked. She let him sleep. Zara was standing by the window. She had been standing there for a while now, watching the street. The people outside had not gone home. They were still there. More of them now. Word had spread the way word always spread when something enormous happened. People coming out of buildings and standing together and looking up at a sky that looked different than it had looked this morning, even though the sky itself had not changed at all. "What will happen to you?" Sarah asked her quietly. "When this is over? You helped us. Your own people will know that." Zara was quiet for a moment. "There are others like me," she said finally. "More than you would think. The Velthri are not all the same thing, any more than humans are all the same thing. Some of us understood that what was being done here was wrong." She paused. "We just needed someone to make the first move." Sarah thought about a 67-year-old woman in a basement in Kansas turning a radio dial out of habit and loneliness and something she could not name. She thought about how close she had come to moving past that frequency, to writing off 13 seconds of compressed signal as interference and going to bed. "The first move," she said. "Sometimes that is the only move that matters." The negotiation took 11 hours. Sarah was not in the room. She was nobody official. She had no title and no rank and no credentials that the Velthri Council would recognize. She was an old woman who had listened to the right frequency at the right moment and had refused to put the paper down and go back to sleep. She heard about what happened inside the negotiation room from Marcus, who heard it from a fleet communications officer who was not supposed to share details, but did anyway, because some information was too important to contain. Commander Reeves walked into that room, looking exactly like his photograph. Thin, gray at the temples, older than the statues built in his memory. He sat down across from the Velthri Supreme Commander who had ordered his execution 48 hours ago, and he looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he placed a small device on the table between them. He pressed play. The recording was from 10 years ago. The original Velthri command transmission from the final days before the official announcement that humanity had lost the war. Sarah had never heard it, but she understood immediately what it contained because of what happened next. Because of the way Marcus described the Velthri Supreme Commander's expression when his own voice came out of that small device, speaking to his own council in their own language, saying words that had never been meant for human ears. "The humans fight too well," the recording said. "We cannot defeat them in open engagement. Every direct confrontation costs us more than we can sustain. We must use a different method. We tell them they have lost. We make them believe it completely. We use their grief against them. A species that believes it has been defeated will not fight. We control the story, and the story controls them." Commander Reeves let it play to the end. Then he looked at the Supreme Commander again. The Supreme Commander said nothing. Reeves picked up the device. He pressed one more button, and the recording played again. Except this time, it did not play in the negotiation room. It played everywhere. Every human colony, every human ship, every speaker on every street corner on Earth that the Velthri had installed over 10 years to broadcast their carefully managed news and their carefully managed version of history. Every single one of them played the same recording at the same moment. Sarah heard it from the library. The voice coming through the street speakers outside in the Velthri language and then immediately translated by an automated system into every human language simultaneously. She heard it, and she looked at her hands, and she thought about 10 years. 10 years of a world that had learned to be small and quiet and grateful for protection that was actually a cage built from a lie. Outside, the voices changed again. This time there was no word for what the sound was. It was not celebration exactly. It was not anger exactly. It was something that happened when a very large number of people understood something true at the same moment after a very long time of believing something false. A sound that was part relief and part fury and part grief for 10 years that could not be given back, and part something else entirely that had no name but felt necessary. The Velthri left Earth within 72 hours. Not all at once. In groups. Their ships lifting from the positions they had held for a decade and moving away from the planet in a way that looked less like a military withdrawal and more like something retreating from a light it had not expected to find turned on. The mining operations that humans had not known existed were shut down and sealed. The equipment left behind. The minerals taken over 10 years cataloged and documented by fleet engineers who arrived with Commander Reeves and spent 3 weeks going through everything with the careful fury of people who were also writing a history that would not be rewritten again. A war crimes tribunal was announced. It would take years. It would be complicated and imperfect and argued over by people with competing interests and incomplete information. Sarah had lived long enough to know that justice was rarely clean or fast. But it would happen. The recording existed. The mining records existed. The fleet existed, and its people were alive to testify. Some truths were strong enough to survive the process of becoming official. Sarah was offered things: a medal, a ceremony, a seat at a table where important people would say important words about what she had done. She declined all of it politely and completely and went home. She cleaned the house. She made tea. She sat in her kitchen for a while looking at nothing in particular. Then she went down to the basement. The equipment was still there. The wipe she had run the night of the patrol visit had only cleared surface logs. The deeper systems were intact. She had built them that way a long time ago without quite admitting to herself why. She sat down at the workbench. She put on the headphones. She turned on the equipment and began scanning the old frequencies. The ones nobody used anymore. The ones that had been silent for years or decades or longer. Marcus appeared at the basement door. She had given him a key 2 days ago without discussing why. He came down the stairs and sat in the second chair that had appeared next to the workbench at some point and looked at her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Listening," she said. He looked at the equipment, the scanner moving slowly through frequencies one by one. Patient and systematic and in no hurry. For what he asked, she adjusted the dial by a fraction. The static shifted slightly. She listened to the shift the way she had listened to everything for 40 years. With full attention, with the understanding that signals did not announce themselves. They waited for someone paying close enough attention to notice. "Someone else out there might need to be found," she said. Marcus sat back in the second chair. He looked at the scanner. He looked at Sarah's hands on the equipment. Then he put his own headphones on and turned to his own display and began scanning the frequencies she had not reached yet. They sat together in the basement in the quiet, and they listened. Outside, the sky was full of human ships coming home. Thousands of them, moving through the atmosphere in long, slow arcs that people all over the world were standing in their streets watching with their faces turned upward. 30,000 names on memorial walls that would have to be changed. History books that would have to be rewritten. A world that would have to learn a new story about itself. Smaller in some ways than the story it had been living in. Larger in every way that actually mattered. Inside the basement, it was quiet. Sarah found a frequency she had not checked in 3 weeks. She listened to it carefully. Static. Old satellite noise. Nothing. She moved to the next one. They had buried the truth in silence for 10 years. They had covered it with broadcasts and ceremonies and statues and a very convincing story told by very confident voices. They had counted on the silence to hold everything in place. But silence was not empty. Sarah had known that for 40 years. Silence was where the signals lived, the ones nobody was supposed to hear, the ones that survived anyway, because some things were too important to stay buried forever. You just had to be patient enough to listen. And somewhere out there in all that enormous quiet, dark something was waiting to be heard. Sarah Chun turned the dial, and she listened.